passages. In other words, they got to choose the ground upon which they wanted to answer this question. And you can see a couple of things they taught me that were instructive. There's this letter that's written to the representatives, and one's in Massachusetts and the other one's in Connecticut, right around the time, because this is really about black people, right? We know what's underneath this. It's about, they wrote it to the House of Representatives in Connecticut. And they said, you know, you're about to have this war to have equality. How can you have this war towards equality when you enslave black people? And then they said something that was really, really interesting. They said, in the Bible, it says that the children should submit to their parents. How can a child submit to his parents if you can sell them? And it says that a husband is supposed to be faithful to his wife and the wife is to their husband. How can that be the case if you can break up their marriage? In other words, they didn't just make the argument about the reinterpretation of certain prohibition passages. They spoke about how the whole of the Bible and the Christian vision of society speaks against slavery. They even spoke about when Paul says, they said, these are enslaved people writing to other Christians. Paul says we're supposed to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. How can I bear your burden when you force me to do so? And so what they're showing you is the question isn't just what this particular text says, it is what does the Bible reveal. And then you begin to have to ask yourself these questions, right? You have to begin to ask the questions the slaves began to ask when they first encountered this text. When I see God creating the world, does it seem like God created a world in which he intended people to be enslaved? And the answer to that question is no. Well, then where does slavery come from? Slavery is the product of the fall. It is a manifestation of human evil, not what God intends. The other thing that you could begin to see when you look at this thing is if you go through most of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's two themes that they return to over and over again, and this is important. God made the world, God redeemed the Jews from slavery. So whenever things were bad, they would say, I remember, things are bad, but remember, he brought us out of Egypt, he did it once, he'll do it again. That becomes the moral reasoning that begins to seep into the consciousness of Israel. You also have God himself say, when you get a foreigner and these people, it's like, treat them well. Why? Because you should remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So here's an amazing thing. God creates a people for whom their founding story is the liberation of slavery. Maybe that reveals his fundamental disposition towards reality more than some of those other passages. So in other words, you can either explain away the Exodus and say that wasn't God's real opinion, he wanted us to enslave one another, or there's something else going on in some of these passages. Well, then what is going on in some of these passages? And I make this distinction in both the laws and the Torah and in Paul's own writings, and not to stop speaking about it here. But there's a difference between laws to reveal what God wanted us to be and God that limits the damage that we do to one another in a fallen world. And I think that what you see is, in all of these places, what you see God doing both in the Old Testament and the New Testament is limiting the damage that we do to one another. And what I want you to understand is, especially when it comes to someone like Paul and Peter, there's a difference between what Paul and Peter says and what we're allowed to imagine. In other words, Paul and Peter are writing to a church with no social, cultural, or political power in a tyranny where they couldn't vote or do anything. But what is the responsibility of a Christian nation in a representative democracy where you can change the laws? I'll say one last thing, and this is one of my favorite analogies, and then forgive me. Y'all, how many of y'all, and I'm not trying to be mean, I just want you, and I'm even trying to push this stuff aside, I want us to think for a second and kind of reason like adults. How many of us have cell phones or computers? Now, I think all of us know where these cell phones come from, right? They come from the majority world. And we know that those cell phones are built in factories that exploit their workers. And if it's not your cell phones, it's your clothes. If it's not your clothes, it's your shoes. If it's not your shoes, your computer. And we know these things. So what do? We actually poke at the edges of it. Oh man, I'm gonna go to the thrift store, and so that makes it a little bit worse. I'm gonna buy some Toms, and they donate a part of it. If something is really egregious, we'll get mad at Apple for a week or two, and then we'll come back. One day, we're going to figure out, and here's the thing, God forbid that anybody here questions capitalism that lives on the exploitation of people, and we're all caught up in its web and we can't escape. And so what do we do as Christians? What do? We know these things. All of us know. But we do these small things to kind of calm our consciences while pointing our finger at the Apostle Paul. And one day, someone's going to look back at us in the year of our Lord 2021 and say, how did these Christians allow this to happen? It is because we can't actually imagine an economy that functions without the exploitations of others. And if we're stuck in this kind of place when we have cultural and economic power, maybe what Paul was dealing with is more complicated than we give him credit for. And then when we begin to ask questions of what Paul did when he had power, when he is engaging with Philemon and Onesimus. When he has power, he actually, in my opinion, intervenes on behalf of the enslaved person and says, you should set him free. And what about in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says to the slaves, if you can get free, do so. So it seems to be the case that when Paul had an opportunity to intervene on behalf of people who were in slavery, he did so. It seems like he also said to the slaves, if you can get free, do so. But it also seems like Paul, and this is the part that you have to wrestle with, is trying to make sense of a world in which slavery is the economic reality. And the last thing I'll say about this, though, it is amazing that Paul thought that the gospel had an impact on that, right? That every aspect of our lives have to be rethought in the light of the gospel. And if we had a whole lot of time, we'd go into the ways in which Paul talks about those things. And the last part I'll do as the caveat, I'm not saying that Paul had a good slavery and what happened in America is bad slavery. What I'm saying is the Bible as a whole creates a disposition towards reality that should lead us towards liberation.
Have you ever wondered how buying is really good?
Let's talk a little bit about the readings. Again, I just wanted to go through that to help you think, or to help, not really help you think, I hope it'll do that a little bit, but to help you explain kind of how I approach the situation. I'm not going to argue with people in such a way that I have to defend the Torah slave system, because I'm just not going to do that. Why would I bother? It's not where the story is supposed to end. How do I know that? Because it ain't where it began. I don't need to defend it. I don't need to defend something that's going to be obsolete. I don't need to defend any world system of this. Because, again, Genesis 1, the Edenic ideal, teaches me that all people are imagers of God. Whew, I'm exhausted now. You know, that was just an onerous thought process. One verse, okay? I mean, just one idea. That is the orienting idea. That is the ideal. So this again is how I approach these things. I'm always asking, and I just think you can have a better discussion with people. A lot of this, the stuff we've done this semester is really about how do you have a better discussion with somebody. You're not going to have a better discussion if you're going to play tit for tat over which slave system was good or not so bad, or this, you know, like you're going to go through Hammurabi's laws and, okay, this one goes in the Hammurabi column and this one goes in the Torah column. You know, that's ridiculous. No one today would want to, again, live, you know, owned, even if it was for 6 years or whatever the Jubilee is. I mean, you don't want to be a debt slave. That's not a good thing. Okay, even in Israel, yes, it had an expiration date, which was nice, but you wouldn't want to be there. There was no bankruptcy court. Okay? This is what you're looking at. Stay out of the situation. So nobody wants to live, you know, under some of these conditions, regardless of how they might have cultural benefits. Again, especially for women, and because, you know, otherwise you're going to be a servant in my household, or, you know, have fun being a prostitute. You know, I mean, these are terrible choices. So you can spend your time talking about that and trying to defend something that isn't the ideal, or you can have a conversation about, well, yeah, that's the way it was, and it wasn't really ideal. It wasn't really what God wanted. It was a place to part for a while, and then, you know, if Israel, you know, takes hold and they honor God, God's going to bless them, and then we're going to move from this to that, and so on and so forth. There's this thing called salvation history. There's a thought trajectory in the Bible. It doesn't end with, the Levitical or, Torah slave laws. It transcends them. It moves beyond them. Again, some of these big picture theological concepts that get applied, here's the point, that get applied to everyone in the New Testament. Everyone. And this is by design. If you believe that the Gentiles were supposed to be grafted in, the outsider was supposed to become the insider. Okay. Then this topic, the whole slavery thing, comes right along with that. Rides the coattails right on there. So again, it's about trying to have just a better conversation. Now, I hope you found some of this interesting.
Paul's letter to Philemon. It was written during one of Paul's many imprisonments, and it's actually his shortest letter in the New Testament, but don't let its size trick you. It's actually one of the most explosive things that Paul ever wrote. Here's the backstory that we can piece together from details within the letter. Philemon was a well-to-do Roman citizen from Colossae, who likely met Paul during his mission in Ephesus, and he became a follower of Jesus. Then later, when Paul's co-worker Epaphras started a Jesus community in Colossae, Philemon became a leader of a church that met in his house. Now, Philemon, like all household patriarchs in the Roman world, owned slaves, one of whom was named Onesimus. And at some point, these two had a serious conflict. Onesimus wronged Philemon in some way. Maybe it was theft, or maybe he cheated him, we don't exactly know. But afterwards, Onesimus ran away. Eventually, Onesimus came to Paul in prison, likely to appeal for help. And in the process, he became a follower of Jesus and then a beloved assistant of Paul. And so Paul finds himself in a very difficult and delicate situation as he writes this letter. He's going to ask Philemon not just to forgive Onesimus and receive him back, but to embrace him as a brother in the Messiah and no longer as a slave. Here's how he does it. Paul opens with a prayer, first praising Philemon and thanking God for the love and faithfulness he's shown to Jesus, to his people. And he then paves the way for his request with this line: I pray that the partnership that springs from your faith may effectively lead you to recognize all the good things at work in us, leading us into the Messiah. Now, a key word here is partnership, or in Greek, koinonia. It means sharing or mutual participation. It's when two or more people receive something together and share in it, becoming partners. Paul's saying that faithfulness to Jesus means recognizing that all of his followers are equal partners who share together in the gift of God's love and grace. And for Paul, this experience of koinonia among Jesus' followers, it's not just an idea that you think about, it's something that you do in your relationships, which moves Paul on to his request. He finally brings up Onesimus. He says that he's become Paul's child in prison, meaning that Paul led Onesimus to dedicate his life and allegiance to Jesus, and so Paul and Onesimus are now family members in the Messiah. He's been serving Paul faithfully in prison, and even though Paul wants to keep him around, he knows that this unresolved conflict with Philemon has to be reconciled if they say that they're followers of Jesus. Which moves Paul on to his bold request, that Philemon receive Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a beloved brother in the Lord. Now, this is a really tall order. Under Roman law, Philemon had every legal right to have Onesimus punished or put in prison, and Paul's not only asking him to forgive Onesimus, but to welcome back his former slave into Colossae as a social equal, as a family member. This is way more than kindness. This is unheard of. It's freeing a slave and then treating them like a family member. It upsets the status quo of the Roman social order. Why should Philemon do such a thing? And here Paul pulls a brilliant move. He recalls that key word from the opening prayer. He says, if you're truly a partner with me, it's that Greek word koinonia again, then welcome Onesimus as if he were me. And if he's wronged you or owes you anything, charge it to me and I will repay it. So in this request, we see the heart of Paul's gospel message being acted out. It's first of all about reconciliation. It's just like he told the Corinthians. In the Messiah, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting people's sins against them. So in this situation, Paul is putting himself in the place of Jesus. He will absorb the consequences of Onesimus' wrongdoing. He will pay the cost so that he can be reconciled to Philemon. But Paul's message was about more than just a legal transaction. It's also about koinonia. Onesimus and Philemon and Paul are all equals before God. They all share the same need for forgiveness. And so the ground is level before the cross, which means that Philemon and Onesimus can no longer relate to each other as master and slave. They're family members. They're brothers in the Messiah. Or as Paul told Philemon and the whole church of Colossae, in God's new family, people are not Greek or Jewish or circumcised or uncircumcised or foreigners or uncivilized or slave or free, but the Messiah is all and is in all people. Paul closes the letter stating his confidence that Philemon will do even more than Paul's requested, and he asks him to prepare a guest room because he wants to visit as soon as he gets out of prison. And then with some final greetings, Paul ends the letter. Paul's letter to Philemon is powerful for many reasons. It's the only letter where Paul doesn't explicitly mention Jesus' death or resurrection, and this is not an oversight. He doesn't need to explain the cross with words because he's demonstrating it through his actions. Paul's embodying here the meaning of the cross. He has made himself the place through which Onesimus and Philemon are reconciled to God and then to each other. This letter also shows us that the implications of the good news about Jesus, they are extremely personal and never private. The fact that Philemon and Onesimus are now brothers in the Messiah, it makes their master-slave relationship totally irrelevant. The family of Jesus' people is the place where all are equal recipients of God's grace. It's a new kind of society, or a new humanity, as he called it in the letter to the Colossians, where people's value and social status, it's not defined by race or gender or social or economic class. In the Messiah, there are simply new humans who are equal partners, who share together in God's healing mercy through Jesus. And that's what Paul's letter to Philemon is all about.